On the night of August 14th, 1920, Millfield, Vermont felt unusually quiet. As the sun went down, the Mallister house on Elm Street stayed dark, and the normal sounds coming from inside were missing. The small white house looked worn but well-kept, and neighbors could tell something was off. Across the country, 1920 was a year of big changes. Prohibition had just begun. Women had finally gained the right to vote, and radios were starting to spread. But Millfield, a town of about 3,000 people, tended to move at a slower pace. Eliza and Constance Mallister, ages 22 and 20, were well-liked in town. They shared the same red-brown hair, gentle looks, and calm personalities. Eliza had just finished teacher training and was getting ready to start work at Millfield Elementary. Constance loved photography and had worked hard to save up for her Kodak Brownie camera, which she used to photograph life around town. That evening, both sisters attended their usual weekly prayer meeting at First Millfield Baptist Church. They left at 8:45, politely turning down the pastor's offer to walk them home. They said they preferred to enjoy the warm night and take their usual route. Earlier that morning, the Millfield Gazette had announced a traveling revival coming soon to a nearby town. The sisters were excited about it, and Eliza had even offered to help arrange transportation for older members of the church. Back at their home, the radio had been playing a popular orchestra program, but neither sister returned in time to hear it. By midnight, when they still hadn't come home, their father, Harold Mallister, grew alarmed. He was a serious man who ran the only pharmacy in town, and it took a lot to shake him, but this did. He went straight to Sheriff Robert Haynes for help. A cold fog had rolled in, and Harold's knock on the sheriff's door came just as the town clock finished striking 12. He told Sheriff Haynes that his daughters had never stayed out late before and begged for help finding them. The next morning, word spread quickly. Millfield was a quiet place where serious crimes almost never happened, and fear settled over the town as people opened their shops and talked quietly over breakfast. At 7:30 that morning, Sheriff Haynes organized a search party of about 50 men. They carried lanterns and walking sticks and spread out across town and the nearby fields. Daily routine stopped, and instead of hearing children play or shopkeepers sweeping their doorways, only the searchers' voices filled the air. The sheriff told his group to focus on the path between the church and the sisters' home and to watch for anything unusual. But hours passed with no luck. Harold waited on his porch all day, barely moving. Neighbors brought food and tried to comfort him, but nothing helped. By late afternoon on August 15th, everything changed. 16-year-old Franklin Meyer, who worked at the livery stable, spotted a white glove in a small ravine about a mile from town. The ground nearby looked disturbed, as if something had been dragged. He shouted for the sheriff, who reached the area soon after. Harold confirmed the glove belonged to Eliza. The sheriff and his deputy followed the disturbed ground into the woods. About 200 yards in, they found a small clearing. What they found there would stay with the town for generations. Eliza and Constance were lying side by side. Their hands were placed as if in prayer, and their dresses had been carefully arranged. Both had been stabbed several times. A small cross made of twigs had been set on each of them, and a torn Bible page had been placed in each of their mouths. The passages were from Leviticus. Millfield had not seen a murder in more than 15 years, and Sheriff Haynes had no experience with a case like this. The town didn't even have a camera. His deputy had to ride to Parsons Creek to borrow one. But by the time he returned, a storm had started to wash away clues. Dr. Walter Fleming, the town doctor, examined the bodies at the scene. He believed the sisters had been attacked shortly after leaving the church, sometime between 9 and 10 that night. The wound suggested a narrow, strong blade, and the attacker had likely been physically powerful. The bodies were moved to the back room of Dr. Fleming's small office, since the town had no morgue. Harold identified his daughters, then collapsed into deep grief and barely left his home afterward. The investigation began the next morning. The sheriff tried fingerprinting with borrowed graphite powder, but the rain had already ruined any chance of finding prints. Church members confirmed that the sisters had attended the entire meeting and left together. Several people mentioned that the pastor, Reverend Thomas Blackwood, had watched the girls closely during the service, more than seemed normal. Sheriff Haynes questioned Reverend Blackwood, a 35-year-old bachelor who had been the pastor for 3 years. The Reverend appeared emotional and called the loss unimaginable. He said he stayed at the church after the meeting, working on his sermon and preparing for the revival. He admitted he had no one who could confirm his whereabouts. In the days that followed, the sheriff reached out to nearby towns. His deputy collected the few pieces of evidence they had. The knife was never found. On August 20th, the sister's funeral was held at First Millfield Baptist. The whole town attended, and businesses closed for the day. Reverend Blackwood spoke about the sister's faith and urged the town to seek justice, while also praying for whoever was responsible. Over the next few weeks, the sheriff interviewed many townspeople. Several possible leads surfaced: a traveling salesman, a rumored vagrant near the woods, and a young man who had once shown interest in Eliza. But each lead collapsed. The salesman was proven to be in another city that night. The vagrant was an older local man who liked camping outside, and the young man had been playing cards with friends. By October, the case had gone cold. With no suspects and no new evidence, the sheriff reviewed the file every day, but had nothing more to pursue. Harold Mallister eventually sold his pharmacy and moved away to live with family. Millfield changed after the tragedy. People locked their doors at night. Women avoided walking alone. Parents watched their children more closely. The sense of safety the town once had was gone. Every year on the anniversary of the sisters' deaths, the Millfield Gazette reminded readers of the case and the loss that had never been resolved. Over the years, Sheriff Haynes and the sheriffs who followed him would take the old case file from storage, review the evidence, and return again with the same sense of frustration. As the 1920s passed into the 1930s, the country changed quickly. The stock market crash in 1929 brought the Great Depression, and people everywhere struggled to get by. Millfield was no different. Local farms were lost to bank foreclosures, and many stores on Main Street closed as money grew tight. During these hard times, Reverend Thomas Blackwood stayed active in the community. His strong sermons comforted many, and he organized church programs that helped families with food, clothing, and sometimes small amounts of money. The church became a central place for support. Blackwood kept a simple lifestyle in the old parsonage beside the church and never remarried. When asked, he would say that his work left no room for family and that the church was his focus. By 1935, 15 years after Mallister case, the tragedy had become more of a cautionary tale than an active investigation. Parents told the story to remind their children not to wander alone at night, and visitors sometimes asked about the unsolved crime, but no new progress was made. Sheriff Haynes retired in 1932 and was replaced by his former deputy, James Collins. The case file, yellow and worn, sat untouched in the filing cabinet, except for occasional reference. For all practical purposes, the case had gone cold. The original investigation had been limited by the tools of the time. Fingerprinting existed but was still new, especially in small towns. Blood typing was rarely used outside major cities. Crime scene preservation depended on each officer's knowledge, and Millfield's small sheriff's office had no special equipment. Even contacting witnesses was challenging, since most homes still had no telephones. The town's social customs in 1920 also made things harder. Some questions were considered too private to ask. Certain topics were avoided out of respect, and people with higher social standing were often treated gently during questioning. Despite all this, the physical items collected in 1920 remained stored in the sheriff's office. The white glove, soil samples, descriptions of the Bible verses, and the early photographs taken after the rainstorm. Dr. Fleming's handwritten notes on the autopsies were saved as well, though they lacked the detail that later medical standards required. As the Depression years passed and the world entered the era of World War II, Millfield slowly modernized. Electricity reached most houses by the late 1930s. Telephones became more common, and dirt roads were replaced with pavement. Cars became the main form of travel, and radios brought news from around the world. Even as the town moved forward, people still remembered the Mallister sisters. Each year on August 14th, the local paper printed a small memorial. Their father, Harold, who had moved to Burlington, returned each year to visit their graves, looking older and more tired each time. Reverend Blackwood continued to lead First Millfield Baptist into the 1940s. His hair turned white and his posture bent, but his sermons still drew large crowds. Every year on the anniversary of the sisters' deaths, he delivered a message about innocence, justice, and a belief that all wrongs would one day be answered for. He reminded people that even if justice had not come on earth, it would come in time. When many of Millfield's young men left to serve in World War II, the town was left mostly to women, children, and older residents. Blackwood expanded his community role again, organizing war bond drives, helping families write letters, and supporting those with loved ones overseas. For a man in his 60s, he stayed remarkably active. By 1945, as the war ended and soldiers returned home, a new sheriff took office, Thomas Haynes, the son of the original sheriff. At 30 years old and recently discharged from the military police, he brought modern training and a personal connection to the case. He said his father spoke about the Mallister investigation before he died and asked him to take another look if he ever had the chance. Sheriff Haynes began by carefully reviewing the entire case file. He made notes on things that did not line up, leads that were never followed, and questions that had not been fully explored. The Bible verses found in the sisters' mouths especially stood out to him. Both passages dealt with specific moral subjects, and he believed the killer chose them intentionally. He wrote in his notes that the choice of verses seemed purposeful and pointed to someone who believed the killings were a form of punishment. The fact that the verses referenced subjects that had nothing to do with the sisters' reputations made him wonder if there were parts of the story that had never been revealed. In January 1946, now 26 years after the murders, Sheriff Haynes began meeting with anyone still alive who had been involved or present in 1920. Several had passed away, but a few elderly residents still remembered the events clearly. One of them was Martha Winters, the church organist at the time. Now in her 80s, she asked the sheriff to visit her home. She explained that she had kept something secret for many years. From under her bed, she brought out a small wooden box containing a carefully folded and aged note. The handwriting looked like Eliza Mallister's. Martha said she found the note in a hymnal the night of the prayer meeting, but kept it quiet out of fear of causing trouble. The note was short but shocking. It said that Eliza and Constance planned to meet someone named Thomas afterward, and mentioned hoping that his wife would not discover it. Sheriff Haynes was stunned. The name Thomas matched Reverend Blackwood. Martha admitted that people had once whispered about how often the pastor looked at the sisters and how much extra time they spent with him. She said she had carried the guilt of staying silent for 26 years. This information changed the way the sheriff saw the entire case. The Bible verses and the careful way the bodies were placed seemed less like random violence and more like an act filled with personal meaning. The sheriff questioned one part of the note, though. It mentioned Blackwood's wife, yet he had always been known as unmarried. Martha insisted that Blackwood had arrived in Millfield in 1917 with a wife named Sarah, who she believed had died within a year. Few people had seen the woman, and she was said to be ill. Sheriff Haynes contacted officials in Medford, Massachusetts, where Blackwood had worked before moving to Millfield. The message that came back said there was no record of him ever being married, and no death record for anyone named Sarah Blackwood in Millfield. With this new information, the sheriff requested a warrant to search the parsonage. The judge was hesitant, considering the age of the evidence, but eventually agreed. On February 12, 1946, Sheriff Haynes and two deputies arrived at the parsonage. Reverend Blackwood, now 61, greeted them calmly and allowed them inside. The first rooms looked ordinary and fit the simple lifestyle Blackwood was known for. The shelves held books of theology, and the house had only modest furniture. But in the attic, the deputies found something alarming. Inside a cedar chest were many photographs of young women from various towns, including clear images of Eliza and Constance. Some of the photos showed the women in private moments, suggesting they had trusted the photographer. Behind a hidden panel in the attic, the deputies uncovered a small concealed room. Inside were a narrow bed, a desk, and walls covered with Bible pages highlighting verses about wrongdoing, punishment, and redemption. The most troubling discovery in the parsonage was a leather journal hidden under the attic floorboards. It held nearly 30 years of entries, all written in Reverend Blackwood's own handwriting. Page after page described how he gained the trust of young women in the towns where he served, slowly separating them from others and convincing them that they shared a spiritual marriage with him that included physical intimacy. The entries about the Mallister sisters were especially detailed. He had begun influencing them soon after arriving in Millfield, using private Bible lessons to introduce ideas that supported what he wanted. According to the journal, both sisters eventually believed they were part of a sacred relationship approved by his interpretation of Scripture. The final entry, dated August 14, 1920, revealed the truth behind the murders. Eliza had threatened to tell her father the truth, and Constance planned to support her. Blackwood wrote that when they met that night, he saw their resistance as defiance. He described using a knife as judgment, and claimed their deaths freed him from sin. He left the Bible passages with the bodies, so anyone who found them would understand what he believed had taken place. He ended the entry by saying he would appear before the church as a grieving pastor, while secretly believing he had done what was required. Sheriff Thomas Haynes closed the journal with shaking hands. He then informed Blackwood that he was under arrest for the murders of Eliza and Constance Mallister. Blackwood, seated quietly while the search took place, did not look surprised. He said he had waited for this day, and that after living with what he called divine forgiveness, it was time to face judgment in court. When news of the arrest spread, the town was stunned. Many people refused to believe it until they saw the evidence of themselves. The journal, the photographs, the hidden room. The trial began on April 15, 1946. The prosecution combined the items found in the parsonage with Martha Winters' testimony and statements from other women who reported inappropriate behavior over the years. Experts confirmed that the journal matched Blackwood's handwriting and that the ink and paper used in the final entry fit the time period. A knife found in the hidden attic room matched the type of blade described in the original autopsy. Blackwood stayed quiet during the trial and did not testify. His attorney argued that the journal could have been a piece of dark writing rather than confession, but the evidence in Blackwood's calm acceptance weakened that defense. The most emotional moment came when Harold Mallister, now 73 and frail, traveled from Burlington to speak in court. He described the pain of losing his daughters and told Blackwood that he had trusted him to guide them. He said the pastor had used that trust for his own desires, then ended their lives when they tried to speak up. The jury reached a verdict in under 3 hours, guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Judge Porter sentenced Blackwood to death by electric chair, noting the serious nature of the crimes and the deep violation of trust. Blackwood was executed on November 8, 1947. His final words were a verse from Proverbs about admitting wrongdoing. Millfield gained some sense of closure, though the town struggled with the fallout. The first Millfield Baptist Church faced a loss of trust and eventually closed, later becoming a community center. A new church was built elsewhere. Sheriff Thomas Haynes continued in office for 15 more years and used what he learned from the case to modernize local law enforcement and start Millfield's first small forensic lab. The Mallister case became an example across the state of how important it is to protect evidence, question assumptions, and understand that people who harm others may hide behind positions of respect. Harold Mallister lived long enough to see justice served, but the trial strained his health. He died peacefully 6 months after the execution. In 1950, the town created the Mallister Sisters Scholarship to honor Eliza and Constance's dreams of careers in teaching and the arts. The money came from the sale of Blackwood's belongings and was turned into something positive for future generations. The case stands as a reminder of how long justice can take, but also how persistence can finally reveal the truth. Investigators from the early 1900s often lacked the tools and social freedom needed to look into sensitive cases, especially when respected figures were involved. Blackwood had used his position to hide in plain sight for years. His journal also suggested that the sisters were not the first women he had taken advantage of and might not have been the last if he had not been stopped. Years later, other towns identified young women from his previous congregations who had gone missing or died under unclear circumstances, though these cases could not be officially linked due to the passage of time. The specific Bible verses he left with the sisters reflected the way he justified his actions. He saw the relationships he forced on these young women as both sinful and necessary. The murders were, in his view, a way to cleanse himself of the guilt he felt. Harold Mallister was never the same after learning what his daughters had suffered. Friends said the details that came out during the trial aged him in a matter of days. Yet the truth, though painful, allowed him in the town to finally reach the end of a long and heartbreaking chapter. Harold Mallister's own journal, found after he passed away in 1948, revealed how deeply he struggled with guilt. In one heartbreaking entry, he wrote that he had been the one who encouraged his daughters to spend time at church and to attend private studies with Reverend Blackwood. He believed he was guiding them toward good values, not unknowingly placing them in danger. He questioned how a father could move forward while carrying such knowledge. The Mallister case continued to influence law enforcement long after it was solved. Sheriff Thomas Haynes used the lessons he learned to create one of the first organized evidence handling systems in the region. He insisted that officers record, store, and protect physical evidence in every case, even minor ones. This new standard helped solve other old cases in the following years. Blackwood's journal also showed the importance of psychological evidence in criminal investigations. The entries revealed how he thought, how he operated, and how he used his position. With personal details removed, pieces of the journal were later used to train officers to recognize the signs of someone who uses influence to take advantage of others. The photographs seized in the parsonage became important for understanding how his behavior changed over time. Early photos appeared harmless, while later ones showed a clear pattern of crossing boundaries. Investigators later used this progression to recognize similar patterns in other cases involving abuse of authority. For the people of Millfield, the truth forced a difficult acknowledgement. Many townspeople realized that they had overlooked signs that something was wrong simply because they believed the pastor could never do harm. Church leaders who worked closely with him for years struggled with their own guilt. One former deacon admitted that they often explained away Blackwood's unusual attention towards certain young women because they trusted him and assumed his intentions were harmless. He said they failed to see what was happening right in front of them. The church never recovered from the scandal, and by 1953 the congregation disbanded. The town later turned the building into the Millfield Community Center. After Blackwood's arrest, several women from Millfield in his earlier posts came forward, explaining how he isolated them and convinced them their relationships had to stay secret. The case pushed churches across New England to add oversight rules, such as rotating pastors and limiting private meetings with young parishioners. Sheriff Haynes' approach to reopening the case became a model for handling old investigations. He combined preserved evidence with new interviews and updated forensic tools, later publishing an article encouraging other departments to revisit cold cases. The Mallister case also showed the importance of questioning assumptions about respective figures. The Mallister Sisters Scholarship, created in 1950, still supports young women pursuing education or the arts. In 1997, the town opened an exhibit honoring the sisters and the investigation that finally brought answers. Their graves remain a quiet place of reflection, reminding visitors that justice can be delayed but still achieved through steady, determined work.